There's a food sitting in refrigerators across the Western world right now that most people eat several times a week without a second thought. It is affordable, familiar, and incredibly easy to cook. Tacos on Tuesday, burgers on the weekend, bolognese on a cold evening, ground beef has become one of the most ordinary things on the modern plate. And yet, when I think about the women I grew up around in Japan, my grandmother, the older women in our neighborhood, my mother's friends, none of them ever ate it. Not because they were disciplined or following a program, simply because it was never part of the world they lived in. Their protein came from different places. Their relationship with food was structured differently, and they aged in a way that, looking back, was quietly extraordinary. I am 61 years old. I grew up watching women in their 70s and 80s who moved easily, whose skin still held its texture, who never seemed to be fighting their bodies. At the time, I thought nothing of it. It was just how things were. It is only later in life, after years of living between Japan and the West, that I began to understand how much the everyday food choices, the ordinary, unremarkable Tuesday night choices, quietly shape everything. Now, let us talk about ground beef. Not to frighten you, not to take something away, but because understanding what a food does inside the body, quietly, slowly, over years, is the kind of knowledge the women in my family always considered worth having. The first thing worth understanding is what happens to your cholesterol when ground beef becomes a regular fixture in your meals. Standard 80-20 ground beef, the kind most commonly sold and used, contains 254 calories per 100 grams in its raw state. That is before it is cooked, before it is combined with anything, before a portion naturally expands into something larger than intended, and a meaningful portion of those calories comes from saturated fat. Saturated fat, consumed regularly and in quantity, tends to raise LDL cholesterol, what is commonly called the less favorable kind. And over time, when the rest of the diet is low in fiber, this can contribute to changes in the arteries that build quietly and invisibly over years. This is not about one meal. It is never about one meal. It is about what happens when a food becomes habitual, when it appears on the plate 3, 4, 5 times a week, year after year, while the vegetables and the fiber remain an afterthought. The women I grew up around never thought in terms of macros or cholesterol panels. They simply ate in a way where protein was one small element of the meal rather than the center of it. The result, without anyone naming it, was a naturally lower intake of the saturated fat that accumulates so easily in a beef-heavy diet. The second thing is something less well-known, and it has to do with inflammation. When ground beef is cooked at high heat, grilled hard, fried in a pan until browned and sizzling, something happens in the cooking process itself that changes the nature of the food. Compounds form called advanced glycation end products, often shortened to AGEs. These are not unique to ground beef, but high heat cooking of animal proteins is one of the most reliable ways to produce them in significant quantities. When we consume these compounds regularly, research has associated them with a pattern of low-grade chronic inflammation, the kind that does not announce itself with pain but sits quietly in the background, affecting the skin, the joints, and the systems of the body over time. I think about this when I remember how fish was cooked in the homes I grew up in. Gently simmered, lightly grilled at low heat with just a little miso or soy, steamed. The cooking methods themselves were soft. The women who cooked that way were not thinking about ages. They had never heard the term. They simply cooked the way they had been taught, with patience and low heat, and the food that came to the table was fundamentally different in character from what comes off a hot Western grill. The third thing involves your gut, and it is the one I find most quietly fascinating. When diets are heavily weighted toward red meat, the bacteria that live in the digestive system begin to shift. Certain species that metabolize the compounds in red meat become more dominant, and one of the byproducts they produce is a substance called TMAO. A study published in Arteriosclerosis, Thrombosis, and Vascular Biology found that TMAO and related compounds derived from substances in red meat together account for somewhere between 8 and 11% of the excess cardiovascular risk associated with regular unprocessed red meat consumption. That is not a small number for something happening invisibly in the gut every day. The gut in Japanese food culture has always been treated as the center of the body, not in a mystical sense, in a very practical daily sense. Fermented foods appear at nearly every meal: miso, natto, pickled vegetables. These are not supplements or additions. They are simply part of what a meal looks like. And that steady, quiet presence of fermented foods feeds a different kind of gut environment, one where diversity flourishes rather than narrowing. When I think about the difference between a bowl of miso soup with tofu and a plate of fried ground beef, the difference in what each one does downstream in the digestive system is not small. The fourth thing is something many women in their 40s and 50s feel, but may not have connected to their food: a gradual shift in how the body handles blood sugar and fat. High-fat ground beef, eaten frequently over time, can nudge the body toward a pattern where cells become less responsive to insulin, a condition that does not arrive overnight but develops slowly, particularly in lives that do not include much daily movement. This metabolic drift is not inevitable, but the foods that surround it matter enormously. A diet built around high-fat red meat, refined carbohydrates, and very little fiber creates conditions where the body has to work harder and harder to regulate itself. Over time, that effort leaves traces in energy, in the way weight distributes on the body, in the gradual changes that women often attribute simply to getting older. In Japan, the portion of animal protein on any given plate is usually small. It is a side element, not the main event. The main event is rice or vegetables or a bowl of something with broth. Animal protein appears the way an accent appears in a room, present, noticeable, appreciated, but not dominant. That proportion naturally limits the metabolic load that comes with regular high-fat meat consumption without anyone counting a calorie or following a plan. The fifth thing is simpler, and it is about the nature of caloric density, 254 calories per 100 grams in raw form. Cooked down, concentrated, combined with other ingredients in a taco or a pasta, the portion that lands on the plate easily doubles or triples without it registering as a large meal. Ground beef is very easy to overconsume, not because anyone is being careless, but because its caloric density is high enough that the point at which the body has had enough arrives before the plate is finished. That quiet, gradual daily surplus, not dramatic, not binging, just a persistent slight excess, is one of the invisible forces behind gradual weight gain that many women notice through their 40s and 50s and cannot fully account for. The women I grew up around ate until they were about 80% full. There is a phrase for it in Japanese, hara hachibu, and it was never a rule anyone enforced. It was simply a natural stopping point. A habit of attention developed so early that it felt like instinct. When the foods on the plate are naturally lower in caloric density, vegetables, tofu, broth, a small piece of fish, eating until comfortably satisfied and not overfull becomes easier, almost effortless. So what did those women eat instead? Fish was the protein at the center of everything. Not occasionally, not as a special meal. Regularly, simply, in small portions. A piece of salmon. Mackerel simmered gently with ginger. Small dried fish alongside rice in the morning. Fish is not interchangeable with ground beef in terms of what it does in the body. Farmed salmon contains approximately 3,000 milligrams of omega-3 fatty acids per 100 grams. Grass-fed ground beef, considered a higher quality form of beef, contains approximately 20 milligrams per the same amount. That is not a small gap. That is a difference of more than 100-fold. Omega-3 fatty acids work in the body in ways that are essentially the opposite of the inflammatory pattern we talked about earlier. They support the heart, quiet inflammation, and contribute to the kind of skin texture and joint mobility that I associate with the older women I grew up watching. Soy was the other constant. Tofu in soups, stir-fries, and cold dishes. Natto, fermented soybeans with a strong flavor and a texture that takes getting used to. Eaten at breakfast with rice. Miso in almost everything. These are not novelty superfoods. They are the everyday protein of a culture that has eaten this way for centuries. Fermented soy in particular brings something additional. Living bacterial cultures that feed the gut, supporting the microbiome in exactly the direction that a meat-heavy diet tends to disrupt. And then there are the vegetables. Seaweed in the soup, daikon, burdock root, lotus root, sweet potato, greens simmered briefly with a little sesame oil. These are not decorative. They are the structural center of the meal. The fiber they contain feeds gut bacteria, helps regulate blood sugar, and fills the body with the kind of bulk and nutrition that makes overeating genuinely difficult, not through restriction, but through simple satiety. Japan's health ministry reported in 2025 that Japanese women ranked first in the world for female life expectancy in 2024, with an average of 87.13 years. That was the 40th consecutive year at the top. 40 years. Not a statistical blip. A pattern sustained across generations. And while no single food explains a statistic like that, the quiet daily choices in the fish instead of the ground beef, the miso instead of the heavy sauce, the vegetable-centered plate instead of the protein-centered one, are part of the fabric of how that number came to be. I am not suggesting you remove every comfort from your kitchen tonight. I would never say that. Food is not only nutrition, it is memory and culture and the pleasure of an ordinary evening. What I am suggesting is that awareness is its own quiet power. When you understand what certain foods do over time, the choices you make stop feeling like deprivation and start feeling like care. The way the women around me cared for themselves. Not dramatically, not visibly, just in the everyday texture of how they ate. If this kind of living resonates with you, the slow, free, everyday practices that quietly shape how we age, I have gathered many of these habits together in a small guide. The link is just below this video. It covers the food habits, the skin rituals, the morning and evening practices that I grew up watching and have carried my entire life. Nothing to buy in a store, nothing dramatic to begin. Just the quiet, ordinary things that, over time, make all the difference.